All right, my name is Tim Lapetino. I'm the author of Art of Atari. And thank you guys so much for coming out today. I'm super excited to share like the fruits of years of work and talk to you guys about kind of what went on behind the scenes of the book and a little bit about the history of Atari. I also have two super awesome Atari alumni here, and I want them to introduce themselves, and then we're going to dig in and talk to them more specifically towards the end. But if you guys want to introduce yourselves.
I'm Steve Hendricks, and I was able to be a part of Atari from 77 to 82, and I worked in coin-op as well as consumer. So I did games like Asteroids and a lot of the cartridge box illustrations, and fantastic place to work. We had a lot of fun.
My name is Barney Huang. I started at Atari in 1972 when we were down in Los Gatos. We were just a small podunk little company, a lot of fun. I was an industrial designer that did a lot of cabinetry design that you see out there today.
Awesome. I'm gonna ask them more specific questions about some of their work as we go on. But I want to tell you guys a little bit of the story about how this book, where this book came from, and a little bit behind the scenes, because it was quite an odyssey. So first, just a little bit about me. Who am I? My name is Tim. As I said, I'm. It's funny. Somebody keeps texting me. People are like, "Hey, you guys ready for the Cubs game tonight?" I'm a Cubs fan, so everyone's talking about the game tonight. Yeah. All right. There we go. Thank you. I'm a designer and a writer. I do both of those things, and for almost 20 years, I've done graphic design and packaging, but I've always loved video games. I do identity work. You see a little bit of just the kind of work that I do: identity, logo design. Packaging work also. This is what I do during my day job, quote unquote. I work at a place called Seed House. We do package design, graphic design, that kind of stuff. So we do food packaging, more food packaging for clients like Starbucks and regional brands. I also have written and designed other books. This is my first book I wrote with my partner Jason Adam, who also designed Art of Atari, did a fantastic job on the design work for it, and co-art directed it with me. We've also done other things. You can see kind of this thread in my work. We did some work for Sony's Hohokum video game for the PlayStation series of PlayStation consoles. Then we also did another book with the folks at I Am 8-Bit in Los Angeles. They do a retro game art show every couple of years, and we did a book collecting the best of like retro video game inspired original artwork. So this is one of my favorite pieces of art. This guy does these pieces. He takes old grenades and turns them into video game art. They're not live, but they're pretty fun. It was a pretty fun project to work on. So there's this thread that runs through my work. Looking back on it, and it really is in retrospect that I realized that how much the art and design of Atari has really, really influenced me. But I don't need to tell you my whole life story, but that's just a little bit of where I'm coming from. And video games have really influenced me, and in creating this book, I saw how those very first days when I was a 5-year-old kid and my dad brought home Atari 2600, a Vader version for me and my brothers, and I would just stare at those boxes. It was a seminal moment, and it really has stuck with me, and it actually has influenced me sometimes, in very obvious and explicit ways, and other times in much more subtle ways. And that's why I'm really glad. One of my goals with this book was really to find out and understand who are the people behind this work. What were they thinking when they did this work? How did they do that work? And also make sure to preserve it and share it with generations, people who grew up with it, but then people who really didn't know as much about Atari, and have it be out there in the world so that people could really appreciate it. So, Atari started, and I'm not going to belabor the history of Atari. Other people who are smarter than me have really chronicled a lot of this work, in other places, in other books. But, Atari started with Ted Dabney and Nolan Bushnell. You see them flanking the the Pong cabinet. And they really started with this idea that Nolan, depending on who you are listening to, either that was his idea or he borrowed the idea of creating video-based arcade games, and it was a totally interesting and unique idea. And they created their first game called Computer Space with this beautiful cabinet and fiberglass absolutely gorgeous, and it actually sold decently well, and it showed them that yes, in fact, there was a market for this. People might be interested in this, and they could sell them. So it went from being a side project to an actual company, and they started working on the next project, which was Huang. This began as really a technical test for Al Alcorn. Could he create something? Could he get those dots to move on the screen and do something in a dynamic way in the way that computer space was done? And it turned out it was actually really fun to play. So they released it as Pong, and it was released under Atari Corporation, Syzygy Engineering. The company had sort of two parts at the time, the engineering side and the Atari part, and the rest sort of is history. It really birthed the market. They showed that there was a commercial market for this, and they started creating arcade games. But they had a lot of success there, and again, there's a lot of stories there. Some of them, and you guys know some of these stories because you were here. But the next frontier was the living room. Could you go into the living room in the 70s and 80s? This is a typical one. That is not me, by the way. And could you find your way in the living room? And for them it was a financial but also a creative decision. Could you use programmable cartridges to make one piece of hardware and then continue to sell software to people? I mean, it's a business model. It totally makes sense now, but they were totally breaking ground at that time. It wasn't obvious that this would be the next step, but it was clearly the frontier. And so they worked on the Atari 2600, which was originally called the VCS, Video Computer System. And you can see these are sketches by the designer Fred Thompson, creating that first look and feel. And it changed as they developed this, as this was getting created. But obviously all the essential elements were there. You see the wood grain, you see the plastic, you see those sort of audio equipment inspired switches from Germany. And you see this is even a cool prototype very early on of what the 2600 might have looked like. And this was fun. Fred, when I met with him, he pulled these. He's like, "Oh, these have been in my shed for 40 years. These pictures." So no one had ever seen these outside of Atari. I don't even know if you guys have seen these. No, and they were still figuring out what would the controllers look like, what would the cartridges look like, how would they be stored. But you can see in the DNA there's a totally, there's a consistent look and feel, and there's definitely a point of view. And so the VCS was born. And so you guys probably all know this. This is called a Sunnyvale Heavy Sixer, right? Because it has that really thick, heavy shielding inside, the RF shielding, and then around the edge there's that thickness. It's really, really thick, and this console's a lot heavier, and it has 6 switches, and this was one of the pieces that was actually created in Sunnyvale. So, the nerds, all of us, we call us a Sunnyvale Heavy Sixer. But there were obviously lots of iterations of this. But the question was, they were creating this technology, there's this really interesting hardware involved, but yet how would you market these games? How would you sell them to the public? Where would they be sold? How would this thing be marketed? When Nolan sold Atari to Warner Communications in 1976, I believe, that was a big part of this, is they had this product they believed in, but the company was a little bit challenged financially, and they needed the resources to launch this thing in a way that was powerful and that could give it the support that they wanted to. And that was, I think, one of the things that Warner was really interested in, because they understood this. These are people who were in books and records, and they understood the idea of selling one piece and then selling people software to continue having those revenue streams. So there was a real question about, how would you sell these things? Where would you put them? Would they go in TV stores? Would they go in mass market? There were some questions to be answered, but really the answers, were going to be creative answers. In terms of, people think of Atari in the same way that I think they think about Facebook or even Apple, that these are tech-based companies, that it's really about this innovative hardware and software. And that's true. Obviously, if Atari didn't make great games, we're not having this conversation, right? But at the same time, Atari really was a creative company, really, really focused on creativity and art and design. And really, at the nucleus, everything they did, there was a creative atmosphere. And I want to talk about that in a little bit more with you guys. There was just a really awesome atmosphere. What would you guys say? I mean, how did it line up with, this was early on in your careers, how did it stack up with other places that you worked in terms of the creative environment?
Well, for me, the environment, it was just a free spirit. The way you dressed back then. I mean, it was sandals, shorts, long hair. It was just a completely free spirit. And as I had talked to Tim earlier, I think one of the things that made the creativity vehicle so powerful was because it was so much fun, there was a tremendous amount of collaboration, whether you were in industrial design or working with the model shop or working with the graphic designer or the illustrator. But there was this collaboration and team effort, and it was just, and we pushed each other, but at the same time just had so much fun doing it.
For me, I had actually been in a business of my own in Southern California and saw that entrepreneurial kind of spirit, and when I joined Atari, it felt like I was home because that same spirit existed there at Atari, and everybody was very creative. We really had fun. Every day we kind of looked forward to coming back to work because there's always something new and exciting we got to work on, and great people to work with.
Yeah, and I think, we were talking about that this morning, about this idea of this collaboration, and that there was a willingness to check the ego at the door, and people were really just seeking, the best product, the best experience, the best design, and, that's a creative environment, and I think it's humbling. I know for me, in my work, it's unique and it's humbling to work in a place like that where people can sort of let their own ego sit aside, be put aside and really, sort of take one for the team. It sounds cheesy, but I think it's really accurate. And I think that's expressed in the kind of work that you guys did. But one of the big reasons I wanted to write this book is I had questions of my own. Growing up with these books, growing up with the artwork, I really wanted to know who the people were. The Atari logo. I'm wearing one on my shirt right now. It was emblematic, not just because it's nostalgic and it symbolized my, growing up, as a kid of the '80s. It's a really great piece of graphic design, and I'm a logo designer, so I feel somewhat able to critique it in that way. It's an iconic piece of design. It's a logo that even now, 40 some years afterwards, people recognize it and they know it. They're selling Atari logo shirts at Target right now, and it's not just for people my age. Kids understand that, and I think that's a lasting piece of graphic design. So my question was, who is the guy who created this logo? In the design world, we know the names of these designers like Saul Bass and Paul Ram, and these really well-known graphic designers who've created iconic logos that we all know. The Apple logo, the Nike swoosh. Books have been written about these people, and yet there was almost nothing out there. Even the wilds of the internet about who designed the Atari logo. And this is George Opperman. And what I found as I did the research for this book, that not only did he design that Atari logo, but he also was a huge creative driving force in this company, and really sort of set the stage for how the work would be done, how illustration will be created. Really had a huge impact on everything really that moved forward, even the things that he didn't actually touch. Now, Steve, both of you guys worked with George. What are some of your impressions? Because obviously he can't speak for himself, and he seemed like a pretty humble guy, which is why we don't have tons and tons of interviews with him about what he was thinking in the work. What was your impression of working with him?
Well, he was my boss directly when I first started, and what's funny is he had a pretty strong ego, but it never really materialized in a negative way, because his creativity was immense, and he had the ability to share that creativity and that creative platform with the rest of his team. You see Bob Flamani and Evelyn Cito now flanking him in this photo. We all had our strengths, and he had an innate ability to bring that out in all of us. And whenever we come to him with ideas, he never said, that's not going to work, go back, and he would always have something constructive to say, and whatever it was really helped make that design even better and stronger. Just a great guy to work with. I enjoyed every minute I was able to work with him.
My experience with George was his passion. This wasn't even a job for him. He just loved doing this. So his creativity just kind of oozed out. And our team, the Industrial Design Group, was just, within 10 feet of Steve and the whole creative team there. And that kind of blended in, and his passion and his creativity and all the team on the illustrators and the graphic design side just spilled over, just like ours would spill over. So this collaboration, and he really drove it. He drove the graphics to be better and better and better. He was a real inspiration.
Yeah, that's cool. And and so I wanted to say, hey, you know what? We have to talk about George, and we have to talk about the way that he built this team. He handpicked people, and then he hired some of you guys right out of school. And some people, there were people that he knew, and he started putting together this creative team of people who had to figure this out. When it wasn't just arcades, it was panel artwork. It was how do you promote this stuff? How do you create advertising? But then also the big thing that the big focus of this book, honestly, is the 2600 and what that art was like, and we'll get to that in a second here. But I want to spend a little bit of time just talking about George. It was really fun. I felt a little bit like Indiana Jones in researching this book. I'm digging out these things, old interviews, obscure videos, and things like that, to even just get little nuggets about, what was George thinking when he was creating some of this stuff and sort of shepherding, this team. And for me, I'm a process guy. I love, it's part of being a designer, but it's also just who I am. I'm the guy who watches all of the director's commentaries and all of the movies that I own, right? Because I feel like some of the real insights into creativity is how do people think about the work that they do? How do they go about it? So I was hunting and searching for all that kind of stuff. I was fortunate enough to get to talk to people like you guys and Evelyn, who worked really closely with George, even before he was at Atari, and really understand that work. So it's kind of a privilege just to sort of share those findings with all of you guys. The Atari logo, again, it's a great shape. We think about, when we talk about identity design, we think about distinctiveness, and does it fit with the brand? Does it tell a part of the brand story? Some people think it's just creating something beautiful. If you have a bad company and a great logo is not going to save a bad company. But if you have a great company and the logo is just kind of mediocre, it still can be something that is powerful and meaningful for people. It's really special when you have both. You have a company, that either makes a product or a service that people absolutely love and they're really committed to and they are invested in, and that actually sort of funnels meaning into this graphic piece. And and it helps if it's really well designed. So this is the Atari logo, and 2 weeks. This is literally 2 weeks before we went to press for this book. I was able to connect to a friend of a friend of a friend who actually had some of the original concepts, presentation logos that George presented to the Atari team when he was still a freelancer. And you can see those along the bottom. They're also in the book, of course. But it's just really neat to see, we didn't have a presentation script. We didn't have any other details other than we know that these were presented to Nolan Bushnell and the rest of the team, George Farraco, and some of those guys. And one of these could have been the Atari logo. And so and that was really cool. That was really awesome. These were inked up on board. They were put on a presentation board. That's how you did it. Honestly, that's still kind of how we do it. And presented to the client and then talking through all of those pieces. But for me, I wanted to know what was the thinking? Oh, sorry, I went ahead. What was the thinking behind that? What was the story? And I look for it in this story. And there's one interview that George gave, and he said that basically this logo was based on Pong. It was his thinking of Pong. Because you think of the original Pong game, it had a center line, and it had two players on each side. And the idea of the ball passing back and forth would sort of, hit one of those paddles and bend it, right? And actually, sort of, push it to have those curves that come out there. Now, I don't know, there's a dirty little secret in the design world that sometimes we create things and then we explain them, right? And some people would say that George Farraco, who was one of the art directors at the time, he had some more colorful language to describe it. He basically said it was just a concept, and it was sold in there. It was picked for visuals, and there you go. But we don't have. George's not here to defend himself. I'm going to go with his explanation. But I think the reality is being able to talk about the work. I was hoping that the work, it does speak for itself. But this was not the only identity work that George did. He had a huge hand in a lot of the game logos. And I think you guys are multi-talented, so we're going to leave you out of this conversation. But a lot of people cannot illustrate and design and art direct. You guys are super talented, so you don't count. But it's a rare combination to have people who can do all three. and George could do those things. And you see like his identity design work, and it's great. It's different. It's definitely of its time. You know, you can definitely see that there's a style in the era. You see these multi-layered lines and some of the color. I mean, there's a lot of orange and bright pink and just beautiful, you know, bright, bold colors. But it made sense in the applications. You see some of George's illustration work. This is, on the right, you've got Missile Command. On the left, you've got Airborne Avenger, I believe, the pinball game. And it's just great work technically. The Missile Command is on the, we put it on the cover of our book because I just think not only is it a great illustration, but there's great design work. You know, the use of the montage and sort of pulling your eye through it and using different perspectives and depth, the depth of the multiple perspectives and the size. It's just a great piece of design as well. And I think, I think sometimes I confuse people when they say, oh, that person's a great technical illustrator, but they couldn't design anything. Right? There's some people who can just really render things, and then there's people who have a real understanding of design. And I think Atari was, fortunate enough to have people like George and Steve and all these guys who, really, there was a culture of great design. It wasn't just people who could, get shading right, and they could, they really had a grasp on anatomy, but they actually understood how to design in a great way. And for me, that's something that's really stayed with me. And it's a lesson, that I feel like I'm still learning every day when I'm doing my work. So it's it's about the culture, and you guys. I see some familiar face back there. You kind of look the same, Steve. But it was a great culture, and and it led to amazing work. And it's my privilege in researching this book is getting to know these guys and really understanding what it was like to be there. You guys felt. You talked about there's sort of this total lack of ego, but also. Did you have a sense, and I think I know the answer to this, but did you have a sense of what you were doing at the time, that you were creating this juggernaut? Eventually Atari would be the fastest growing company in the in U.S. history. But did you feel like you were just like strapped to a rocket, or what was it like?
For me, I'd show up to work and it was like, I'm getting paid to do this, and I had no idea that we were setting new ground. It was just fun. And I think the other thing that made it so fun was we had no reference point. We were it. And so we had complete creativity, and there was nothing to compare it with. And that's what made it even more fun. And then one thing I just noticed when you were showing George Opperman, one of the things also that made him unique was he was a gentleman. I can remember he was the only one that ever wore a tie. Right? I'm here, he's got his tie off, but you look at the way we dress, that's how we dress, we had no idea that this was going to, set a foundation for the future gaming.
Yeah, Barney and I have known each other for quite some time, obviously, since the Atari days, and we get together from time to time, and just thinking about, the interest in it this far into the future, never thought about that. I came to work every day just looking forward to some fun stuff I got to do, and like he said, we got paid to do the coolest stuff, and there wasn't anything out there that we were trying to compare to. Well, let's be as cool as this company. There was none of that. So we kind of were creating our own identity through the artwork and the environment we had to work within really fostered that kind of creativity. And it was, it sounds boring, but it was fun. I really had a fun time doing it.
Yeah. I think the other thing too is imagine being surrounded with all these people and they're all creative. And that's the environment that we worked in. And creative not only in the work we did, but in some of the juvenile pranks and fun that we had.
All right, let's tell one story. A clean one.
We'll get into that later. Well, one of the things I was just going to say is it really wouldn't have been possible without the creative minds of the game designers themselves. I would always spend time with every game designer who was responsible for the title I was working on, trying to get into their head, what was this game about? What were you thinking? Because obviously when you see the gameplay, there's not a lot of great color stuff going on there. And, you know, so we had to create this story, and that's what made it really fun, because we were taking what was in their imagination and literally, depicting what was in their imagination, not what was on the screen. You know, a lot of people have said negative things over the years. Oh, that was false advertising. But for us, if we showed what was on the screen, it wouldn't be nearly as exciting, and you wouldn't have that opportunity to really get the sense of that game designer's imagination. And that's where we were trying to take it.
Yeah, and I think that's a super important point, is you got to remember this was cutting edge technology. And I think for those of us who grew up with this, okay, that totally makes sense. But also, younger people looking back and saying, hey, those two things were not the same. Because we're used to seeing now, video game screens, like the art that's used to promote it is just as good, if not better. It's the same, right? We're talking super, multi-threaded processors, super realistic, hair shading. I mean, all kinds of crazy stuff. But here it was like, this was cutting edge. And I think that's an important thing to remember, is that because of that, the artwork and the design was an essential part of this experience. There was no internet. There was, there were some TV commercials and there was some print advertising, but generally you were going to interact with this by walking up to a store, picking up a box, and your first encounter with Space War or Indy 500 or asteroids was going to be this box art, right? And so that actually impacted every experience you had with the game after that, right? You're going to see, you're going to look at adventure, and you're going to see dragons and castles, and then you're going to plug that game in, and it's a bridge from there to your actual game experience. So it was a crucial and essential part. And I don't think it was necessarily by design, it was just necessity. That was what you guys were doing. But I think looking back on it, it absolutely was a huge part of the game experience. And I think that's why people remember this art and say, hey, you know what? I wasn't just a block. I wasn't just a square. I was the knight fighting the dragons and looking for the golden chalice. It really was this bridge for people's imagination. And I think that's one of the reasons, not just from a technical standpoint, but from sort of an emotional connection, why people really, still, dig on this artwork. So I want to walk through just a few pieces. And this, there's a ton of great art, shameless plug, go buy the book. You can see all of it, but I did pick some of the pieces so they would fit in this actual, up on screen and not just cut everything off. But I mean, so much of the artwork is great, and it was a real privilege. It's a great experience as a designer and as a sort of curator to look at the book and be like, okay, there's so much good stuff. I don't have to trade and figure out, oh, am I going to put bad stuff in? There was all great stuff, and it was kind of painful when, because of space reasons, even on 352 pages, we still had to occasionally cut things out. But it was really easy in the sense that it was all really great. So you see work here, like this is the 5200 version of the Asteroids by Terry Hoff. It's just great. I mean, just the perspective, really interesting use of color. Here's Hiro Kimura's Berserk for the 2600. This is one of my all-time favorite pieces. And you can just see like his use of the airbrush, the soft edges and just the sort of explosions and the laser. It's just got such a depth, I think you can really see, and that really comes across. Here's Burrell Dick. He did, this is Centipede for the 2600, I believe. And again, I don't know why the centipede's smiling, because he's evil, but just a great use of dimensionality, and see the way that the centipede goes in and out of three-dimensional space and really sort of carries you into it, and it's just really fun. And there's a real like fantasy element to this. This is from Crazy Climber, which is a little bit more obscure game. This is also Hiro Kimura's, but it's just great use of perspective. I really love the color. You feel like one of the big sort of main colors here is this this really cool palette of greens and pinks and blues, and I think it really stands out in that way. Here's Gus Allen did Dig Dug. I mean, it's some of the all-time awesome character design. I think it's really fun, and also just absolutely, being as someone who, we scanned a lot of these slides in the original artwork and got to really see up close what it looked like, and just the impeccable, gradients and just the beautiful craft here. Like, it's just really, really well done. Here's an unused Pac-Man for the 5200 version. This is a little bit different than the one that was actually ended up on the box, but it's just fun to see the little differences, and you sort of have to guess a little bit about why choices were made visually one way or the other. And this one, Pac-Man actually kind of has an eyelid, which is kind of weird. I guess you have to if you're going to kind of squint like that. But you know, it's just neat to see, and you see the color choices and the texture. It's really fun. Here's Phoenix. This is beautiful. I think some of you guys may know if you have like the old Atari Age magazines. This was actually printed into a full color pull-out poster. I totally had that on my wall as a kid. It's just really neat. And here, this was supposed to be for Real Sports Basketball, a game that was never released, but just again, great use of montage. You know, great color. Love those washes. Here's another Terry Hoff piece. I don't believe this was actually ever printed. This was for a manual illustration for Vanguard. But again, great color, great use of shadow, and even, you know, interesting. And we could, you know, have a whole art class here. It's not art appreciation class necessarily, but it's just really neat to see how he used shadow and didn't make it just black. You see a lot of color within a color, and it really drives the piece. And you've got really contrasting colors that really grab your eye. Are there any Star Wars fans in this audience? Right? Ralph McQuarrie was the guy who basically was responsible for the look and the character designs and some of the even matte paintings in the original Star Wars games. He did one Atari piece, and it was fun talking to one of the artists saying, hey, we should get somebody like Ralph McQuarrie to do some art for us. So somebody just called him up, and you know, they thought, oh, he's too busy. He's too much of a big deal. He won't do it for us. He was elated. He loved it. You know, he totally did this piece for Vanguard, and you can totally see. I mean, does that not look like a combination between the Death Star and Hoth? I mean, it totally does. You can definitely see that in the art. Here's a great one by Bud Thon. This is for Space Invaders, 5200 Space Invaders. And it's just some great looks. And really, I think for me, the interesting thing is seeing how some artists would interpret the games, especially the games that were released on, you know, multiple consoles or multiple times. Just the necessity of having to rethink that very, very simple game and do it in a way that you can bring something fresh to the table. And here's this may be my all-time favorite piece by Cliff Spawn. This is for Super Breakout, and I think that, you know, a lot of creative people have a little bit of, you know, OCD in them, and I think for me it was, as a kid, I remember looking at this box, staring at the way the rainbow wall is curved and reflected on the astronaut's helmet. It just actually blew my mind, because, you know, now it wasn't just a set of lines. It was actually this thing in three-dimensional space, and as a little kid, I remember distinctly just being absolutely blown away by that and just staring at it. You know, and then of course, very upset when my dad threw away all the boxes, you know. And I even remember having a conversation about this as a 5-year-old. You know, I said, I want to keep all these, because I like them. And my dad's like, it's like keeping the refrigerator box. What do you keep the games, you know? And I showed him, right? But no, seriously, and I think that kind of connection, it's that sort of two hits there of that nostalgia of growing up with this stuff and sort of interfacing with it as a kid. But the second one is just, it was really well done, you know. And I think you guys, like, there's a lot to be super proud of, because, you know, you have this takes you to this, right? Right? And that's Super Breakout, great game, totally awesome game, super addicting. But this was the path that we took from one to the other, and this informed that. And I think there's no way to really separate those two. And I think that's a really important thing. So, you know, that all came into the book, and I want to talk really briefly, and then I want to ask these guys more about their work, and I want to open it up and give you guys some time for questions as well. But you know, creating a book like this, I wanted to make sure that everything got into it. But this book, you know, it was a string of coincidences and crazy things that happened to actually have this book actually be a physical thing that you can sit and have on your coffee table. This happens to be my coffee table. But it started in 2010. I wrote a blog post. I worked as a designer at a firm of my own with a partner, and we decided for Thanksgiving we were going to write an article about designers and artists we were thankful for. And a couple of the people that I said I was thankful for was Steve Hendricks and Cliff Spawn. and I talked about Atari and how it really influenced me. And it was great. Okay, great. Went out there just like everybody else. I wrote a blog post. Figured nobody read it. Awesome. But 2 years later, somebody put a comment up on there. 2 years later, this woman said, "Hey, that's super cool. That I know Cliff Spawn. I grew up next door to him. Would you like, And I was like, what? And so we connected and she said, hey, would you like to meet him or would you like to talk to him? And I said, absolutely. So I called him up and I was, this is like sort of calling up Elvis, but I found that, he was super friendly and also he remembered an amazing amount of detail about the work that he did at Atari. And we spent maybe an hour and a half on the phone. I did not expect to have that kind of conversation. But I hung up that phone. I thought, hey, you know what? This is really interesting to me. There could be a book here. There might be a book. So hung up the phone. It wasn't more than a couple weeks later that another collector on AtariAge.com, he and I had been talking on and off, and he told me, hey, I have a whole bunch of slides and 4x5 transparencies, a bunch of Atari stuff that I got from somebody. Are you interested in that? It's a longer story. I'm not going to give you all the details here, but I ended up acquiring these from him, and it was hundreds of pieces, and it was all kinds of artwork. This is just some of what was in that huge cache of stuff. And then I had a second thought. I said, hey, there might actually be a book here. Because now I actually had some artwork, and I knew I could talk to some of these artists. And Steve, you and I connected later on, and then it just sort of spider-webbed out there. And I think one of the cool things about this is, for me, a designer growing up in this sort of hybrid analog/digital world is finding all this stuff and then saying, hey, you know what? Because these slides and transparencies, this was part and parcel. This was a normal part of working. You guys would do the art, and then you'd have a photographer come in, and they would shoot the art. They'd shoot it flat, and then that film basically would be used to create the boxes and everything like that. Well, the cool thing is unlike a lot of the original artwork, these have survived. These have been sitting in people's desks, in their, packed away in boxes, and some of it waiting to be found. And the cool thing is with modern digital technology, we can scan these things on really nice scanners and get super high resolution images, so that it's as good, some maybe not better, but as good as having the original art, because we can actually blow some of it up to be even larger than the originals. And you can see all that detail. You can see the brush strokes. You can see the care that went into those. So I had a couple things, right? I had started talking to artists, and I was slowly interviewing them. And then I started to get connected with other people at museums like the Strong National Museum of Play. A little plug for them. They have something called iCheck. It's the International Center for the History of Electronic Gaming there. And they have a fantastic collection of artwork and a lot of Atari stuff. And they were kind enough to let me visit there as a researcher and was able to dig in and find a lot of really cool stuff. You saw things like engineering drawings and original art. This is from a collector in the Midwest who shall remain nameless right now, but this is a Cliff Spawn original. It's a huge piece, and he had all this stuff, and he invited me to to his place, and we photographed a bunch of it, and a lot of it, artists shared stuff. Steve, you had digital versions of a lot of your art. Some people send me slides, even though they had never met me. They sent me stuff, and they trusted that what I was doing, I wasn't just going to run off with them, but we were actually trying to tell the story of Atari art. This is a logo that George Opperman did for the 10th anniversary of Atari. And this was printed on lucite, and so the guy who had this actually got a photographer friend to photograph it, and here's the setup in his studio. So there's all these things, like there's dozens and dozens of people who helped and were a part of this. Here's some of the work that came out of a collection of a guy named Court Allen, who rescued a bunch of art and production art when he went to Atari to buy some filing cabinets for his new business and found out that they were selling them, but before they sold them, they were dumping all this stuff into huge dumpsters. And they said, oh yeah, we can just get rid of it for you, so it's really light when you can take these home in your truck. And he said, no, just leave it in there, it's fine. And they looked at him like, I think it was just construction workers. They thought he was crazy. But he kept a dozen filing cabinets worth of Atari history, for decades. And he was kind enough to let me get in there with my wife and photograph and scan as much as we could before he had to send it up, and it was acquired by another museum, which was super cool. And I think the fun thing for me is just to be able to see not only the work, but also see a little bit of the Atari culture and how things were done. This is from the Atari 2800, the Japanese version of one of the VCS versions, and just little notes. We saw this all over the stuff we found about how this would work, and as a designer, to get to see that, in that era, what was the process like, and it was analog, and it was, physical, and it's just really kind of wonderful. It's a little time capsule. We had to do a lot of photography ourselves as well. We had consoles. Excuse me. We had consoles. We had artwork. We had to photograph a lot of the stuff. But thinking about this isn't a book. This book is a time capsule in a way, but I want to present it in a modern way, in a way that would be interesting and would highlight the art and design of the actual work that you guys did. So we did a lot of original photography to make sure that we could capture it in that way. This is one quick story, and then I want to fast forward and ask you guys some questions about your work. One of the guys whose dad was a VP at Atari, when he was a kid, he actually got to be one of the models on this box. This is the Atari 2700, it's called, and it's a remote control version of the 2600. This was never actually, it was produced in a limited production run, but it was never released. It was canceled before that happened. Well, this guy had basically a paper proof of the box that was never made, and it was rolled up in the back of a closet, and it looked like, bugs had been eating it, and it had little stains on it. But he sent it to me, and we felt like there was something there. We were able to professionally scan it, and then over the course of a year, actually able to digitally retouch it and keep everything the way it was, but retouch it so that it was back to the way it would have been when it was brand new, and then we had a box fabricated. So we could actually see what would this have looked like. Now this wasn't final, it didn't have a UPC on it. There were certain things that were obviously missing, but I felt like this was one way that we were kind of saving things from the dustbin of history and sort of bringing them back. And I can't tell you, I've never been more excited about a cardboard box. And when I opened that and saw the printer did it, and they did a wonderful job. But it's just really neat to be able to tell those stories. And the guy's name is Matt Osborne. You can see him on the cover there. He's the little one. Just there's a cool story there. He was able to be a model because his dad worked at Atari. This never got made, but he saved it. It was a memento, and we were able to recreate it, and in a way that I think was very legitimate. We just took what was there and sort of amplified it, and that was fun. I mean, what a privilege. I mean, I can say, yeah, this was work. I mean, that's pretty cool. So let's talk about Steve and Barney, and this is a great picture of Steve. This came from I believe an action shot. It was for an advertisement, right, for a coin-op game called football, but it had multiple sports games on it.
Yeah, that was just one of several. What's funny is I was probably the youngest guy on George's team, and he and Jim Kelly called me the kid. Think about it now, it's like I'm so old. But it was pretty fun. So he used me as a model because I worked for free. And he didn't have to get a model release. So he used me in ads and stuff like that and coin-op. So that was fun. And what was fun is the way we kind of shared the talent amongst the teams, because as I mentioned, I started with George, but then John Hayashi offered me a job in the consumer team. He was the manager of the design team, and he said, you know what, I'd really like you to do the cartridge box illustrations for us, and would you be interested? And so I talked to George. He goes, oh, it totally sounds like a great opportunity for you, Steve. And is that okay, George? He was totally behind it, and it was kind of hard to leave George because I loved working for him. But John was equally on par with George in terms of being a great manager and allowing us to be really creative. So it was fun.
And let me play Charlie Rose. Let me play Charlie Rose for a minute. Let me ask you about some of these pieces.
Sure.
So this is soccer for the 5200. One of the things you always see is the line work in here. You can really see your brush strokes. How for these guys, tell us how can you see that? How did you do that? Why did you do that?
Well, one of the things that's sort of funny is when John asked me to come be part of the team, he said, we're hiring out a lot of freelancers to do this work. Cliff was actually the guy who created the Atari look in the beginning. And John said, can you emulate the look that Cliff's done? I think I can. And so it was just a matter of kind of, re-engineering what Cliff is doing. Of course, Cliff came in, he'd work on projects with me, and hey, so how do you do that kind of stuff? I'm thinking, oh, no worries. It wasn't any, classified top secret stuff, but we would basically put down a gesso texture that emulated our sketch. So we come with concept sketches, and then that sketch we would blow up to full size. And these paintings were done usually pretty big, 18 to 24 inches, 20 by 30. So we worked big, and then it all came down really tiny so it looked sharp. So, I usually work pretty loose. I wasn't like Terry Hoff or some of the others, where it was a lot more detailed and almost photorealistic. It was much more sketchy and washy. And so the idea was the gesso would create the texture that almost looked like, brush strokes. Mm-hmm. And then, pencil with gouache and acrylic washes over that. And a subtractive method, so you're pulling highlights out with, a brush or with a rag or whatever was handy.
That's cool. That's very cool. A couple of these. Now, there was a practice, and you weren't the only model. You guys actually had other people modeling for you for your work as well.
Jim Kelly was a favorite of mine because he was right there. So one of the illustrators on the team, and he just had a great face, and so he was my model for both of these, and try different techniques. So the one of Othello was a lot of airbrush work, and kind of experimented with that, do some fun stuff. So we were basically utilizing people that worked there.
That's cool. Let's talk about this, and then I want to dig in.
That's one of her engineers in the painting, and some neighbor kids. Well, the concept sketch was actually just some stuff I made up, and then we talked about the ages, and we talked about, when I say we talked about with the game designer, okay, so really what's the age group for this, or target audience, things like that, and what were you thinking when thinking about, well, it's checkers. It's not brain surgery, but I wanted to create something that was kind of fun, and
well, and there's
a kingdom.
There's a story here, okay, it's checkers, guys. Yeah, it's video checkers, but it's still checkers. But yet you told a story here. There's royalty involved. There's a castle. You're like, what sort of Game of Thrones intrigue is going on here? There's a story there, and that's it's captured in the in the facial expressions and the emotion and the way you use the montage. It's like, this seems like checkers. It's pretty damn amazing, and that's great. Obviously, some people would say, oh, you're dressing up, something that's really simple. But at the same time, you're adding. It's an additive process. You're telling a story here, which I think is just wonderful. It's far cooler than checkers probably has a right to be. But I think that's pretty awesome. That's great. And here's Warlords. We talked about this a little bit before.
Yeah, and Warlords, the model for that was Jim Heather, who actually created the Warlords game. And Jim and I have stayed in touch over the years, and it was just fun being able to work with employees. Joel van der Wijk is the dad, who's at wit's end because his sons were the ones that were warring with each other, and Joel van der Wijk was the production artist in the Coin-Op group, and it was fun to I would be a kind of a casting director going around the company, and man, that guy would be perfect, or that gal would be perfect for that. And we just used him as reference, but creating something that I think was fun.
That's super cool. Cool. I'm gonna blow through these because this is one of the best pictures Barney of you. I asked Barney for a picture of himself, and this is what he sent me. It's great. So we know that you can destroy Spider-Man. That's pretty important. Let's talk about your work. Let's talk first about Coin-Op. What was the process like when you had a game like you're thinking about these cabinets? What was your thinking?
So one of the things was how do you draw people into the game? And so if you kind of look at the way the cabinetry is, the whole idea was to suck you in. Instead of being two-dimensional, we try to create a three-dimensional format. And so one of the things we experiment, if you look at video games today, it's all, it's pretty flat, it's just a piece of plex. And so we started to experiment with vacuum form cards that would have speakers on the side and have some dimension. So that's kind of what we played with. We got as far as prototype, but it was the cost. It just cost too much. But that was the whole idea, was how do you bring somebody into the game?
Yeah, and so like you did some of that work and then you started standardizing them, is that right?
Yes.
So, and then where did that production budget go? Where did you focus after that?
So, yeah, so a lot of things came into ergonomics. So I'd never heard of the word, didn't know what it meant, but, so like driving games and, how do you design it for a kid and all the way up to adult, right? Because it's, different. So we played a lot with that, but the creativity back then, it was basically no restriction. So, and that was what was so cool, just like the illustration, it was just use your imagination. And again, there was no reference point. But we did a lot of mock-ups, and that was what made it so much fun, was we actually did a lot of mock-ups to play with it and see.
And is that what this is?
That's a mock-up, yeah.
Right, and that's you?
Yes.
And that's pole position, right?
Yes.
Yes. That looks kind of scary. It's kind of tight.
Yeah. Yeah, and the thing on the right was Indy 500. So back then, you only had a few pixels, and it was a top view of a cars going around. But how do you make it interesting to draw people? Again, if you take a look at this, it kind of sucked you in. You had to look down into it. So that was the whole idea of the design.
That's cool. Let's talk a little bit about consoles. I know you were involved in the 7800. Tell me a little bit about that. And that was obviously a team effort, right? There was quite a few of you guys working on it. What was that process like? What was the thinking there?
So when we looked at the original design, the wood grain, because that was the big deal back in the 70s. So we were looking for inspiration, and we used Bang & Olufsen B&O as our inspiration. It was clean. You didn't have any of the controls. There were no knobs, and that was the whole idea of this. So if you look at this, there are no switches sticking up. There's no paddles. It was just very clean, and that was our inspiration. And one of the things that we did with a lot of our designs that a lot of people don't realize, the 45-degree angles on the edge. That was the whole idea, was to kind of break that edge to kind of give it a different dimension.
Yeah, that's cool. Well, and talk about Bang & Olufsen, because maybe not everybody is like super nerdy like we are. Tell them, like, why was that important, and where did that come from, that ethos?
Yeah. So European Dutch, it was at that time the premier design, very high-end stereo equipment, and it was known for simplicity, out-of-the-box thinking, radical, and art. It actually won a lot of art and design awards, and so we try to emulate that.
That's cool. This is the console we were talking about before, the 2700, that was never released, but there's a lot of elements that work their way from here into things like the 5200. You talk about this, because this is such a, and it's hard to tell on the screen, but it's kind of brown. Like, and I love brown. Like, I'm waiting for, everything. Got 5 minutes, great. I personally love brown, and I love to, everything is black and silver now, and I'm waiting for the renaissance of brown. So this was particularly interesting to me. But let's talk about this for a minute, and then I want to open it up to questions.
This was an evolution of the design that you saw prior. So here, and this is pretty radical for back then, is the depression of those switches, right? So I mean, today it's probably pretty pedestrian, but back then it was pretty radical to do something like that. And it was like one of those gotcha moments, like, wow, this is so cool, right? And so that just evolved. As far as the color, I don't quite remember how the color evolved from that.
And do you remember why this wasn't made? I've heard stories, but
that's a good question. I don't remember that part.
the only things that I've heard is that the RF, like the radio frequency, was making people's garage doors open.
That's what Dan Kramer said.
Is that what Dan Kramer said? Yeah. So that's a problem, obviously. Atari eventually figured it out, because they did release, radio, wireless controllers later
They
on.
didn't have anything to isolate them, so you could affect the next door neighbor's console also if they weren't separated frequencies.
That's great. But it's a beautiful piece of design, and this is really fun, because these photos came from a guy in Boston who I met, who actually found this at a thrift store, which I was like, you're like the luckiest guy ever. You should play the lottery. And Barney, these are a couple of concepts that you also sent me while you guys sort of started working on kind of hybrid all-in-one consoles / computers. Am I right?
Yeah, this was, it was really kind of interesting. So this was designed specifically for a game, because nobody would buy a computer back then. Why would you buy a computer? So we designed this for a game. But if you noticed how narrow that was, I actually got into trouble for that because it's like, that's not realistic. Right? Because the CR tube is, it's like about 10 feet deep. So if you look at how narrow this was, and so we were trying to design basically a complete system, a game system that you have the cartridge all in one.
Great, that's super cool. These are great renderings. I love being able to see it physically. I mean, it's a fast way for you to sort of get those ideas out. All right. Can you just tell us what this is?
It was the beginning of Oculus. So this is one of let's create a video game that you actually wear. And again, no reference point. If you look at it from an ergonomic point of view, it's horrible, right? If you actually study this thing, but it was the whole idea of having your own personal gaming system. Again, no reference point, but that was a lot of fun doing that.
That's great, awesome. All right, questions. We can take questions from the audience. If you guys have one back there, and talk loud so everybody can hear it.
Yeah, Barney, if you started in '72, did you work on Gotcha?
No.
Okay. Then I don't have a question.
And for you guys, Gotcha is the infamous, it had very interesting controls that were modeled after parts of female anatomy. That's all I'm going to say about it. All right, down here.
There's been stories about the game designers not getting credit for their work in the game, and I noticed some of the artwork had your signatures on them. Did those end up on the pieces, or were you guys sort of treated as anonymous people in the cog of Atari also, or were you more recognized?
We were just allowed to sign stuff as if it was, a piece of art. And for me, it would have been cool to see credits for everybody on the back of the boxes. I never even paid attention because I, like I said earlier, really valued the input of the game designers. And again, if it wasn't for them, we wouldn't have these cool games to illustrate. So did they even put their credits on the back of the box?
No.
They're anonymous Atari people.
Yeah. Yeah, down here.
Hi, I worked for Atari in the consumer electronics group in '82 and '84, and it was not John Hayashi at that time. I think he was in another group. I was with Alice Law, and I worked on the Ms. Pac-Man, Countercard, and the Mobile, and I worked on Big Dug, and I worked on a lot of things. I was more in the inclusive, as when things started changing a little bit. And I worked with Gus Allen, and as far as I could tell, he was the only one that seemed to sign the work that I saw. And I was just wondering why he was able to sign it, because it seemed like a lot of people didn't. So was there, did they say, no, you cannot sign?
What Jim Kelly told me was that if you signed it, they wouldn't say anything about it, but it was problematic because if it got cropped out or if it was partially cropped in, some of it was just practical, was the fact that, if it was halfway cropped in or out, that would look weird and people would notice it. Then I said, and he did a lot of illustrations as well, and, someone asked him about it, well, how come you guys are signing it? And this is a quote from Jim. He said, well, artists sign their artwork, programmers don't get to, and that wasn't really nice, but he said, he
Sounds like something Jim would say.
he looked at it like, you're an artist. Artists sign their work, and so I don't think there was anything malicious about it. It was just, there wasn't a clear policy. It sounds like.
Oh, okay. And then I have another quick question. And then I'll let everything go. When did that break? I mean, I came in through '82 to '84. So like I said, I worked with Alice Huang in the consumer electronics group. And we were like a mile away or more from where the illustrators were. And the only time I ever went over was to work with Gus Allen and one of the other illustrators. But was there a split between the consumer electronics group? Because I know John Hayashi was there at the time, but he was in a totally different, that group was in a totally different building. I'm wondering, well, I guess I don't know, because I worked so hard when I was there for the 3 years I was there. I was just head down, elbows out. I mean, I was working really, really hard. So I don't know any of it. how did that split happen? How did we, because we did all the, like I worked on the 1983 sales binders and things like that. Do you know how that happened? That there was a split?
It seemed to me like, and this is what a couple of the copywriters talked to me about. It said that like, as the production went up, you know, and there's more and more people involved, there started getting more and more layers. And I think this was after you had left, Steve. There's more and more layers between people. There was a lot of marketing people, and that was sort of, oh, we'll just put these people in this building and those people over there.
Oh, okay.
You know, and it really is a function of Atari just getting large,
Oh,
right?
okay.
You know, so now suddenly you've got people with MBAs in there who have opinions about things, and you know, and people get pushed into other buildings, you know, and that's my understanding.
Oh, okay.
So I'm really sorry, that's gonna have to be, I just didn't feel comfortable cutting off Pam Smith with all people. But we are about 20 minutes over on this panel, and we're into the next panel's time at this point. So
Uh-oh.
you have to cut it off, I'm really sorry.
Great, thank you guys.
Thank you.